Hi, I'm Anthony Chetri, and this is my course assessment video. My plan for the video is to actually address each question individually. But before I get started on that, I just want to kind of rehash some history and touch upon things that I talked about briefly in my pre-course assessment paper. So the first and most important thing is my religious developmental history. I grew up in a staunchly Catholic family of Mexican and Italian descent. Grew up going to church, attending regularly. The values, beliefs, rituals of Catholicism were a large part of my family and how we interacted with each other and our environment. And I, in middle school, began in parochial school, attending both Catholic middle schools and high school. And during that time, a big shift happened for me, moving away from the religion due to, in part, my history with anxiety as a child, and also in learning about the religion, in learning about how it became its history. I moved further away from the church. And this really informed my research as well that I've been into in the last few years. Um, Currently, my dissertation is on locus of control and development of a scale around locus of control. And with that, I think I'll move into the questions. The first is, what are you prepared to do about the possible impact of your developmental history on your clinical work? And I talked a little bit about my history with religion, but important here is how I define my spiritual belief, and I define myself as agnostic, and I did so in the pre-course assessment paper. But that has changed a little bit since this course, and it's given me a little more insight into my belief system and how I define myself, but I'll talk about that in a little bit. But really important here in preparing about how your developmental history is going to impact clinical work is awareness of your developmental history, awareness of how it became, its history, where you are developmentally. And in the book by Cashwell and Young, this book right here, which I actually found to be really, really helpful and an amazing read, there's some stages of developmental history taken from different theories. And the one that really spoke to me was Fowler's theory. And in Fowler's theory, I now find myself in the conjunctive faith stage, which I believe was kind of moved forward by this course and by the readings. And I'll talk about that in a little bit as well. But I think that's the first part, is really being aware, and I think awareness is going to be key through a lot of this, is being aware of what your developmental history is, how you define yourself from a religious standpoint or spiritual standpoint, and then allowing that to inform your impact, allowing that to be able to see where your impact is coming from. Right? And then I think the other thing we can do to kind of be prepared to see your possible impact and deal with that impact is to really work on becoming competent, to find that competency, to know in each situation where your history comes into play, how that history impacts others, why it comes up when it does, why is that salient? And a lot of that is actually related to the second question of how do you think your religious and spiritual identity will impact your clinical work and professional relationships, and what are you prepared to do to address this? With the history comes and experiences that shape your worldview and your religious identity comes some limitations and preconceived notions about your worldview and others. And mine is certainly not exempt from that. With my history, moving away from the church, I do have biases in place. I do have limitations and preconceived notions that are going to kind of impact my interactions with others, how I see their worldviews, how I see how they came up with their own spiritual identity. That history is definitely going to have impact on my professional relationships as well. But when it comes to clinical work and clinical relationships, this is where we need to be more aware. Again, awareness coming into play here as really key component. And in the text by Cashwell and Young, they talk about this idea of broaching, or an attitude of openness and willingness to learn about others and their culture. And when taking that in consideration, and with my own uh, religious and spiritual identity and others, it's important to know that each person is going to have a different identity, even within common religious or spiritual identities or backgrounds. Each person is going to have a different developmental history, a different experiences that are going to inform that developmental history. And being able to be open to that is going to be a large component of knowing how your clinical work and professional relationships are impacted by your identity. The third question, how do you think your religion or spiritual privilege or marginalization will impact your clinical work and professional relationships? And what are you willing to do to make sure these identities do not negatively impact your clinical work and professional relationships? Again, awareness is so key here. Awareness of how others are going to perceive you. Awareness of how you're interacting with others. And for me, this is not only a religious or spiritual component, but also a more broad multicultural component. Because I am a phenotypically white male, that's going to come with its own privilege within other contexts. So this kind of cultural component can obviously be a stumbling block, something I really need to be aware of. And in that, I need to make sure that I'm also not imposing any cultural dominant or imperialistic views of society onto the context of the relationship or the client. Now, with my phenotype, also might come some preconceived notion that I might be of the dominant imperialistic religious viewpoint as well, saying that most white males would probably be defined as identifying as Christian or within that mold. And so there might be some kickback as well in clinical work with clients seeing me in that light and then having some maybe discomfort if there is some difference in their preconceived notion of my identity and their identity, some discomfort in wanting to share about spirituality or speak about spirituality because of their feelings that they might be marginalized further in the relationship. But something interesting is that with my identity as an agnostic, I'm also marginalized. So there's the ability for me to be in a situation where I might have a client or in a professional relationship where the other person might be of the dominant or imperialistic view, and they might see me differently because of that, or maybe as less than. So this kind of notion of privilege and marginalization for me is something that I'm going to have to continue to explore because it's a little bit more complex and convoluted in my situation, seeing that I do have some religious background in Catholicism, which shares some components with Christian faith, but also I'm not of that identity anymore. And so this really becomes a very complex issue. But once again, awareness is going to be key. Awareness of where my thoughts, where my feelings are coming into play, and where theirs are, where their identities are coming into play, and how the interaction is taking place. Question 4, how do you intend to work through any unresolved religious, spiritual history, values, and biases that might negatively impact your clinical work? And I've kind of touched on this a little bit already, but self-awareness, again, at the forefront here. And continue to increase that self-awareness. Where are my values? Where are my biases? And in the text by Cashwell and Young, again, they talk about this as awareness, self-awareness, as a key to empathy, as a key to be able to empathize, to know where you stop, where they begin, to pull upon your own self-awareness and what you've gone through and add that to the context of the client and say, yes, I've been through struggles like this, or maybe I have not, and I need to be aware of that in the moment to be able to provide the accurate empathy for the client. Also, I need to recognize blind spots that might negatively impact therapy. Because of my developmental history of my biases that come with moving away from organized religion, there's definitely a propensity to kind of have those blind spots, to see things differently, to attribute different factors to other people's identities and maybe thoughts about religious affiliations. I need to continue to inform myself of my spiritual identity and my development. This has been an ongoing process for me. It's changed over time for me, and it's going to continue to change over time. Obviously, going from very religious background to not has had a drastic change on my worldview and how I interact with my environment. And I don't see that as something that's going to stop changing and stop evolving. And so I need to really be informed of what's going on there and how it is changing and developing. I also need to make sure that I continue to remind myself of the benefits of bringing in this religious context into therapy. Articles in the beginning of the semester from Gaelic, from Kroc, really talk about coping strategies and their benefits, the benefits of meaning and purpose that come with religious belief. And I need to make sure I continue to remind myself of those and continue to integrate those things, despite what my identity might be, what my beliefs might be. It's important to make sure I'm continuously working with that and pulling religion, if the client identifies as such, and putting it in and making that part of the experience. And I also have to remember the ethical obligations I have to the client, right? What we're doing is not bringing ourselves into the room. That's obviously not the goal, but to work with the client, with their belief system, how they identify and define themselves. And we have an ethical obligation to do that and not bring ourselves in, not bring our own thoughts, our own plans, our own identity into the room, only as a way to connect, but not as a way to develop goals or plans. So, remembering that there's an ethical obligation there. Question 5. How do you intend to address any difficulties you might have in treating patients who bring religious and or spiritual issues to therapy? One key thing here is, with people with different backgrounds, is taking a posture of not knowing. Being able to allow them to talk to you about their identity, about their worldview. And this kind of connects with the idea of broaching I talked about, the attitude of openness and willingness to learn about others and their culture. Also, in the article by Russell and Bohan, they talk about issues of religious competence in regard to conflicts. And they say, remember that these conflicts occur in a broad historical and socio-cultural context. So we need to take history in consideration for people and how they develop these ideas and what these ideas and identities mean. We need to also remember that belief does not equal truth, but we need to be aware of our own beliefs and know that they're not absolutes, and neither are the ones that the individuals bring to therapy themselves. We need to be able to see that as part of their identity and not an attack on our own, or vice versa. And then, again, I touched on this, we need to integrate beliefs into goals and plans. We really need to make sure that we're doing that. Their identity and their beliefs need to be put into their goals. We need to have open communication. And we're talking about here, again, in the Cashwell and Young book, they talk about complementary communication. So being able to give empathetic communication in response to their difficulties and struggles. And then let the client know from the beginning, from the paperwork, they're open and willing to talk about spirituality. So important that they feel comfortable in doing so. Question 6, how does this course assist you in beginning to work through and or gain new insight regarding issues regarding religion, religiosity, and spirituality? And it's really increased my knowledge base around the subject. Even though I have experience in it from my research, it's really been able to help me expand that. It's also informed my own understanding of my spiritual beliefs, seeing that I'm not just agnostic, but really an agnostic atheist. I don't really believe that any God exists, but also don't claim to know that one exists. It helped me go beyond just saying that we need to be multiculturally competent, but showing us how to do so through the readings. And Cashwell and Young has been fantastic in that, and giving examples in really giving developmental ways of doing it as well. This class has really pushed me to further my developmental stage, like I said, out of the individuative, reflective faith stage and into that conjunctive faith stage that Fowler talks about. And then it's really helped me to expand my competence here at the beginning stages of my clinical work and really reinforced my research interests, to really push me to become more culturally competent and giving me the tools to do so through the readings, through the experiences. And that's really been a large factor in the impact this course has had. Just to conclude, this course I've really enjoyed, and it's really been a really nice reinforcing factor for me, as I've mentioned, for my future clinical work, for becoming more multiculturally competent, and for continuing my research. And I'm very excited to continue this after the class, to continue to look at my developmental history, and I'm excited to see where this leads. So thank you very much, and I look forward to taking the tenets of this class further.